As people come into the room, it's kind of nice to have them post where they are zooming in from in the chat. So if you would like to do that, go ahead. And I will start with a welcome. Thanks to the Center for Climate Literacy for sponsoring this event. My name is Brian Attebery, and I am one of the 3 editors of Fantasy and Myth in the Anthropocene, which we are celebrating today. In his book, The Ministry of the Future, our unofficial poet laureate of the Anthropocene, Kim Stanley Robinson, has one of his characters propose, "I think we need a new religion." And then the speaker backtracks a bit. Well, maybe it's not a new religion, maybe the oldest religion. All those economic plans, always talking about things in terms of money and self-interest, people aren't really like that. They're always acting for other reasons than that, spiritual reasons. So as Robinson's character says, self-interest isn't enough. We have learned from recent events that people don't make decisions based on logic, and indeed, they can end up clinging to their beliefs all the more strongly when confronted by evidence. So what does change minds? Well, social networks, gut feelings, and the right sorts of stories. Our book, Fantasy and Myth in the Anthropocene, comes out of this insight into human nature. We do need something like a new or very old religion to shake us up and make us see things differently. Or rather, we, the editors, felt the need of something that is part of every religion, a mythic narrative. If, as they say, a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy, a myth is a religion without temples, priests, or creeds. Those are things people go to war for, but they might not be willing to save the world for them. Mythic stories, on the other hand, organize the world. They motivate us, change us, inspire us, in the old sense of that word, breathing in something divine. And one place we can play freely with myth without alerting religious zealotry is fantasy. So the origin of this book was a conference held in Czech Republic in October 2018, organized by my co-editor and co-host today, Tereza Dědinová. Tereza is assistant professor in the Faculty of Arts at Masaryk University with expertise in Czech and fantasy literature. It was Tereza who invited me and our 3rd editor, Marek Osiewicz, to come to the Czech Republic as keynoters, and I have to say that up until then, I had not thought of putting my interests together in environmental issues and fantasy. So thank you, Tereza, and thanks to Marek for his inspiring address in Brno and for having the vision of broadening the conversation from conference to book, and especially a book that brings together scholarly and creative meditations on the present moment and the future. Along with the 3 editors, we've asked 4 of the contributors to talk today about their part in the project. That leaves out, if I did my counting right, 10 academic and 20 creative contributors. Among the latter are Jane Yolen, Nisi Scholl, Catherine Applegate, Grace Dillon, Donna Jo Napoli, David Wiesner, Sean Tan. Well, you get the idea, an amazing array. Likewise, we had a wonderful set of scholars who are represented today by Lindsay Burton, Alexander Popov, John Rieder, and Caryl Lesuma, each of whom will tell you something about their pieces in the book. And then we'll have time for questions from Tereza and me and from you all. But first, let me turn this over to my co-moderator to finish the welcome and the introductions. Tereza. You're muted.
Again, sorry. Thank you, Brian. I will start or rather follow with at least very short introduction of Brian Attebery. If you have just anything to do with fantasy, Brian's name is kind of hard to miss. He has won multiple awards for his work on fantasy and science fiction. Most recently, if I'm not mistaken, the World Fantasy Award for his long-time editorship of the Journal of the Fantastic in the Arts. In 2019, he was the Leverhulme Visiting Professor in Fantasy at the University of Glasgow, and one of his projects there was helping to launch a scholarly series from Bloomsbury Academic, Perspectives on Fantasy, which he edits along with Dimitra Fini and Matthew Sanger. He's the author of several books, Let Us Remind at least, Stories About Stories, Fantasy and Remaking of the Myth, or Decoding Gender in Science Fiction, and co-editor with Ursula K. Le Guin and Karen Joy Fowler of the Northern Book of Science Fiction. He's also editor of Le Guin's work for the Library of America. And something really to look forward, his most recent book, Fantasy in the World, How Does It Mean and What Does It Do, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press in this very year. Just several short months, I suppose. So, as also Brian said, this book has 3 editors. One of us initially planned to enjoy a little peace and quiet in the audience, but Brian and I decided to drag him here among us, to thank him for his enormous energy, passion, and creativity he has poured generously into this book. He also stands behind these wonderful projects of the Climate Lab, so please help me welcome Marek Ozsiewicz. It wouldn't be possible without him here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
We are also very, very happy to have here these 4 panelists, Lindsay, Alexander, Karen, and John. We will tell you a bit about them just before they share their insights from their chapters. Let me just now give the word back to Brian.
Yes, I will introduce our first contributor, Lindsay Burton. She's a doctoral student at Cambridge University in the Faculty of Education's Center for Research in Children's Literature. She researches such themes as artificial intelligence and climate change in children's and adolescent literature, and has published on Carlo Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio. Her contribution to our volume involves, quote, playing with the trouble, which is a variation on Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, in Nnedi Okorafor's Akata Witch series. So, Lindsay.
Hi, everyone, and a big thank you to the editors for inviting me to contribute to this panel and to the anthology as a whole. My chapter, as Brian said, titled Playing with the Trouble, Children in the Anthropocene in Nnedi Okorafor's Akata Witch series, started as a way to honor Okorafor's amazing trilogy, which is now complete and has been officially named the Insipidi Script series as of January 2022. It tells the story of 4 young magical people who have to learn how to master their different personal magics, not to save the world, but to preserve the world. That distinction matters because the Insipidi Script world, which is our world, isn't in danger from a lone evil figure bent on destroying humanity or society or anything like that. There's nothing for our heroes to vanquish. Their tasks look more like management and troubleshooting of the various evils that occur. But in Okorafor's trilogy, evil itself and its lesser counterparts, trouble and mistakes and mischief, aren't erasable. They are a permanent and in many ways necessary part of the world. The protagonists are asked occasionally to defeat evil, but mostly they have to stay with their trouble. And sometimes they fail and they have to carry on regardless. And that need to carry on in spite of almost guaranteed failure of these protagonists reminded me of what Donna Haraway calls staying with the trouble. Her most recent book of that same title is the other major angle of the chapter, particularly her call to make kin, not babies, which is a slogan that appears right at the start of the book. When I found it, I was taken aback by it, as a children's literature scholar, and more recently as a new mother, of course, we're all familiar with the concept that the most damaging thing a person can do to the environment is to create a brand new person who will presumably go on to consume resources and pollute, etc. And the idea of making kin is, of course, a positive one, not a new one for Haraway, and one that comes up many times in this anthology and in fantasy literature at large. But the idea of not making babies, so to speak, colors Haraway's entire discussion with a version of the Anthropocene or of posthumanism that really, really emphasizes the post to the point where there's no longer a human future to imagine. I do think that Haraway is right, that we need to stay with the trouble of the Anthropocene, but realistically, I think we also need to stay with the trouble of humanity. Or as I suggested in my chapter, we need to learn to play with that trouble. This involves appreciating babies, children, even teenagers as kin, the way Haraway means it, as entities with their own way of being that we can learn from, which is really accepting children as part of humanity's we. And we already do to some extent, but we don't go as far in the real world as we do in the world of fiction, particularly fantasy fiction. So novels like Ecological provide somewhat of a blueprint for playing with the trouble, for infusing our approach to the Anthropocene with childhood in a way that makes a difference to our outcomes as an earthbound species.
Thank you, Lindsay. I will follow up, and let me start a bit personal with something I absolutely love about this book. When searching for the new narrative, new religion, new story Ryan talked about, we knew we needed variety, a multitude of voices, perspectives, ideas, approaches, both in content and style. If you look at the table of contents I shared via chat just a few minutes ago, you can quickly judge this is not your regular scholarly volume, or better said, it's not only that. First of all, each part following Marek's brilliant introduction is opened by a short mythic narrative written by Brian concerning the respective element and Anthropos, whose everyday name is Child of Man. Anthropos always tries to have his way with the elements, to tame and diminish them, to make them serve him. And let me tell you, he does not end well. Reading these narratives might feel deeply familiar. We know these stories. However, we usually see them in the form of news headlines or scientific papers. Brian himself characterized them as, well, current events like newspaper headlines in the myth form. Translating our everyday reality into myth is a very citable opening to what comes after them. We have 17 academic chapters interwoven tightly with contributions by 20 artists. Each one of them deserves credit for hard work, great initial idea, and creativity. But we are talking 37 people here, and to proceed individually would take loads of time. So I will have to talk general and let appreciation of the individual names and contributions on your side. Our academic pieces cover a wide range of crucial topics, including confrontation of the Anthropocene as a whole, as a concept, or of his various aspects, a challenge against the so-called capitalist realism, transformation of the extractivist mindset, human kinship with trees, land, or ocean and its life, non-human narrators, analysis of the weird fiction, necessity of hope, creativity, and playfulness, topics of ecocidal unconscious and planetarism, permaculture and ideas of voluntary modesty, modern human mythologies, or literalizing hyper objects. You will find analysis of novels and myths, films and shows, cartoons and adaptations or teen rights, with a great, however, not exclusive emphasis on young adult fiction. The artist pieces interweave with these academic chapters, different in style and tone, but connected with the topic and the sense of urgency. You will find here reflections serious and playful, provocative and kind, poetry, and two sets of color plates, contributing with just yet another layer to the evolving picture. They invite you to imagine and reimagine ourselves and our relationship with the planet, our world, our home, to stop trying to control and conquer all the time, to acknowledge non-human animals as persons, to see them what they are, to be blinded by hope, because the world around us is much more magical than the wildest fantasy, to open our eyes to the exploitation founding the Western way of life and consider and reconsider what's worth keeping and what's not, to cry with the orca we took from the sea and put it in the sky, and now we just don't know what to do about it, how to take it down, to stop hiding from what we have done and start fighting for a better future. Together, all these contributions ask you to change perspective, not just once, but again and again, with every new academic chapter, poem, reflection, and picture, to see them and us and the world around us with eyes wide open, honest, and inspired to search for alternatives, to start new paths, some of which might be very old, only we have forgotten them in our flight to progress and growth. I will now pass the word to our second panelist, Alexander Popov, who is an assistant professor at Sofia University, Sam Kliment Ochridsky, in the Department of English and American Studies. He is also a researcher at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences in the Department of Artificial Intelligence and Language Technology. His research and interests range over utopian and science fiction studies, post-humanism, eco-criticism, artificial intelligence, and cognitive science. He has recently published articles on climate fiction, on the possible word semantic as applied to fictional narrative. And he is currently working on the interdisciplinary research project focused on artificial intelligence in the context of the humanities and social sciences. Alexander.
Thank you, Tereza, and thanks to everyone for this wonderful book, to the editors specifically, and to all my co-authors. I'm joining you from Sofia, Bulgaria, where until about an hour ago it was snowing, which is highly unusual for this time of the year. I don't remember the last time I've seen this at this time, which is, I guess, just another sign that we are in the time of trouble, as Lindsay said. And my chapter is, I guess, also a play on Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, only I've decided to change another word in this phrase. It's staying with the singularity. It argues that we need to stay with the singularity, but not the kind of transcendent technological singularity that we associate with the Silicon Valley, which will make people gods and emancipate us from nature once and for all, but rather with the more philosophical notion of singularity, something that Haraway also explores in different books, this moment of tension, of ontological tension in the meeting of different entities, maybe entities from different species, or maybe not even living entities. So this is the moment when we can become not just a little bit different from human, we can become more than human. So human and non-human can become together in this moment of uncertainty. And I explore three different fictions, which can be called fantasy fictions and mythological fictions from certain angles. These are the novel Ka by John Crowley, which is the story of an immortal crow. The novella by Brooke Bolander, The Only Harmless Great Thing, which is the story of elephants and their interaction with humans in an alternate reality. And Richard Powers's The Over Story, which is the story of forests. I explore in all these three stories how human narration is entangled with non-human narration. So this new kind of fantasy, I think it gives us a different way to access non-human stories. These are no longer the stories of magical creatures, which in the end sound just like human stories in many occasions. This is something different, I think, because it allows us to both stay with the specificities of non-human beings, but also translate that in something that is interesting, that's accessible, that is human language and literature and myth, to arrive at something that's more than human. And I think fantasy is very, very useful in this sense because it allows us to be playful, to play with the trouble. It allows us to diffract, to bring together many different disciplines like semiotics and physics and biology and the study of myth. And we can do it in many different ways. And I try to show in the chapter that in all three of these fictions, we have different patterns of diffraction between humans and trees and crows and elephants. And ultimately, I think fantasy, this kind of fantasy allows us to create these carrier bags that Ursula Le Guin wrote about, which I think are a much better vehicle for telling stories in the Anthropocene. And these are all wonderful fictions, and I'm sure that all the articles in the book are wonderful. I can't wait to read them. I just got my copy yesterday, so I've only started. But yeah, with that, I will pass over the word to my other co-panelists.
Yes, next we're going to hear from John Rieder. John is Professor Emeritus at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and is the author of two groundbreaking works of science fiction scholarship, Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction, and Science Fiction and the Mass Cultural Genre System. His most recent book is Speculative Epistemologies, an eccentric account of science fiction from the 1960s to the present, published in 2021 by Liverpool University Press. And in 2019, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Science Fiction Research Association. His essay in our book is titled Kim Stanley Robinson's Case for Hope in New York 2140.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks to Mark, Brian, and Tereza for including me in this project and in this panel. It's a real privilege to be in this company. So the topic of my contribution is Kim Stanley Robinson's 2140, a science fiction novel set in a carefully realistic near future. So unlike the other panelists, I'm not dealing with literary fantasy. Let me explain then how I am engaging with the topics of fantasy, myth, and the Anthropocene. In my contribution, I'm thinking about fantasy not as a literary genre, but in a broader sense, as an integral part of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. I'm writing in this essay about the type of fantasies that help support what Mark calls the ecocidal unconscious. These fantasies are an unacknowledged component of widespread beliefs about what's real and what's possible. Beliefs that may make climate change seem inevitable and inescapable, or may simply make it seem so distant or abstract that it can be ignored. To expose the fantastic nature of such beliefs is to step outside of the world they construct, to find a way to imagine things differently, and to encourage hope for positive change. Kim Stanley Robinson's novel is very much about this type of fantasy in two connected ways. Many writers have connected the climate crisis to the workings of capitalism, some even substituting the term Capitalocene or Capitalocene for the Anthropocene. Robinson's novel deflates the set of beliefs that has been called capitalist realism, the conviction not so much that capitalism is the best type of social organization possible, as that it is the only possibility, that there is no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher famously said. Robinson considers that set of convictions delusional, and his novel sets out very deliberately to undermine it. That enables him to elaborate the counter fantasy of a successful political revolution, one that involves a pretty detailed analysis of the 2008 financial crisis and what should have been done in dealing with it. But what about myth? I argue that New York 2140 retells the myth of the flood. Robinson's modern flood is caused by the melting of the ice caps, which by the time the novel takes place has raised ocean levels by more than 50 feet. The story takes place in a future lower Manhattan that has remade itself as the new Venice. There's a version of the Ark, complete with endangered animal species. But the main thing is that the flooding leads indirectly, and by no means completely, to the purgation of a corrupt social order and the construction of a new, better one. I haven't got time to go into more details about this, but if you're interested, I very highly recommend the novel. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And we have one panelist left. It's Caryl Lesuma, who is an assistant professor at Brigham Young University, Hawaii, in the English program, where she also serves as the composition coordinator. Her research interests focus on young adult literature, literatures of the Pacifics, and place-based pedagogy and rhetorics. She has published on contemporary adaptations of Pacific folklore and place-based composition pedagogy. Please, Caryl.
Talofa, everyone. I apologize, I'm a little bit hoarse today. But again, I'm also, like the other panelists, very honored to be part of this project. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And I've sort of started peeking into my copy that I recently received and love it so far. I'm gonna go ahead and post some. It's not letting me, hold on. I'm gonna post some key terms that I'll be using that are, here we go, that are just some Pacific terms in Hawaiian language, Olelo Hawaii, so that when I say them, you know what they mean. So moana is what we call throughout the Pacific, what we call our ocean, the Pacific Ocean. Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, are referred to the indigenous people of Hawaii. Remythologization is a term that I've borrowed from scholar Selina Tusitala Marsh out of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where she talks about taking these mythic figures from our ancestral stories and reimagining them within our contemporary environment. And then key terms, especially at the bottom here, are mo'olelo, which is again, Olelo Hawaii or Hawaiian language term that is a multi-purpose term. It can mean story, it can mean history, and it can be a whole bunch of other different sort of communicative genres that are passed down through oral tradition. And the last one is niuhi, which is a term that refers to man or human-eating sharks. And in ancestral mo'olelo, they're often able to shapeshift between shark and human forms. And in my essay, I look at two different remythologizations of niuhi shark stories. So I am a scholar of what I call YALO, or young adult literatures of Oceania. It sort of exists at the nexus of Pacific literatures, indigenous Pacific literatures, and young adult literature. I was born and raised here in Hawaii, but my family's ancestral lands are located in what we now call the US territory of American Samoa. And I'm very interested in how indigenous writers in Oceania are conceptualizing and portraying indigenous youth identity and responsibilities in these YALO, in YALO fiction, and how these portrayals can empower our youth. So one of the hugest problems that we face as people of the Moana right now is ongoing environmental degradation that's caused by colonial exploitation of natural resources, militarization, tourism, etc. And it's happening on land, but it's also really profoundly affecting our ocean, which is the medium that connects all of our islands throughout the Moana. And so another side effect of all of this is that we've lost a lot of our land, our language, our cultures, and especially here in Hawaii, that has also translated into a loss of connection to the natural environment, to the land, to the sea, to plant and animal relatives. And so for a lot of indigenous peoples here in the Pacific as well, we've been living in an Anthropocenic dystopia for a long time already. And so the good news, though, is that currently we have incredible efforts that are being made to recover a lot of these things that have been lost for the next generation. And I think that YALO texts are part of that effort. So in my essay, as I said, I look at two different remythologizations of Kanakamali, Ancestral Mo'olelo About Niuhi Sharks. Both stories feature youth characters, and I argue that their portrayals imagine possibilities for reestablishing good relations with the natural environment, and they charge youth readers with the responsibility to do so. So I just want to close here with part of a quote from the conclusion of my essay, which is from Aboriginal author Amberlynn Kwaimulina from Australia, which outlines the stakes of environmental and cultural narratives for our Indigenous youth. She says, quote, "Our children will be the ones who struggle with the ripples we leave in our wake, and they will be the ones who count the cost of our decisions for the generations that will follow them. If we teach the right values, then the behavior of our children will reflect those ideals. In the Aboriginal way, it's about getting the story right so that they can learn the right ways to be." Thank you.
So that is a quick introduction to the book. And I think if you have not seen it, you realize that there's a whole lot more than that. And I will, because we haven't done this yet, show you what a beautiful object it is with a gorgeously designed cover and incredible color inside, thanks to a grant that Marek got that helped defray some of the publication costs. We should open it up now to questions, either from panelists to one another or from the audience. And I will start by reading a question from Jennifer Attebery that was directed to John that says, "I'm wondering whether counter fantasies can be intentionally deployed or even weaponized on behalf of environmental rehabilitation, and if so, how?" And I think anybody can answer that, but start with John.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, short answer, yes. I think that's what Robinson is doing, in fact, in New York 2140 and also in the Ministry of the Future, the book that just came out. You know, there's what Robinson is doing there is kind of a two-part approach to fantasy. One is to expose the fantastic nature of certain kind of damaging beliefs, like, you know, the conviction that the only good economy is a growing economy, and at the same time to enable imaginative openings to think about a different world, a better world. And that is where I think, you know, counter fantasy comes in.
Yeah, and if I can follow up on that, just listening to what everybody was saying and what I know about the contents of the book, there are so many different forms that we've talked about in which narratives can be sort of embodied, and they range from the ones you might expect to be addressing historical change and environmental destruction, like utopias, dystopias, post-Holocaust stories, or nature essays. But then you've got things like fairy tales and fables and traditional sacred stories like the ones Karen was talking about. How do all of these different forms interrelate? Do we have to choose, or can we somehow find common ground among all of these narratives as part of a project? So that could be addressed to anybody.
Yeah, if I may, yeah, I think so. I think I agree that Robinson is doing that. We can read these stories in the Ministry for the Future, where we have these riddles where different objects, non-human objects, they tell us about themselves, like the carbon atom and the market. And I think that's what he's doing. He's trying to take these stories, but turn them around a little bit so that at the end of New York 2140, we actually get capitalist realism, like in a judo move, it's reused to actually help the revolution. And I think also in John Crowley's novel, Ka, for instance, we get all these different angles at the Crow story, like told by the Crow or by the Native Americans or by somebody else. So I think we shouldn't be working towards some master form. We should be trying to like bring all of these together, because that's also a political project. I think it's not just a matter of form.
And any of you can go ahead and unmute and speak up. I see Karen sort of thinking through things there.
I was just agreeing that I think we shouldn't be stuck to a single kind of narrative. As we know, everybody learns differently, everybody's touched differently and motivated differently, and different forms can help to accomplish that for different people. A form that might not work for one person may really touch and motivate someone else to make the changes that need to be made. And so, yeah, I just was agreeing. That's all I was doing.
Yeah, I also agree. And I think A Core Force trilogy does this too, but with the, isn't quite the same thing, but with the school story. She writes from a Nigerian American perspective. And in some ways, her trilogy is so reminiscent of a school story, but in many other ways, you know, it doesn't, there's no separation. The school is not an escape. It's not the carnivalesque sort of, you know, barrier. The real world is so intertwined with what the students are doing. And it does just bring an entirely new perspective to the way that fantasy elements can have an impact on the environment and just on the real world in general.
I will just jump with a few words into that too. From what I did, what I focused on my chapter was the Terry Pratchett's Tiffany Aching series. And when I reread it with the intention to write something about it, I was really surprised how closely the witch ethics in the series aligns with the principles of permaculture. How much actually this series can tell you and even learn us about not only how to behave towards the environment, but how it can share this feeling of connection, to being united with your land, with the place you and community you take responsibility for, and you part it like a, well, basically you feel it like a part of your body. So I also think that fantasy can be very powerful means of transmitting these messages.
I will read another question. This is from Christina Bacalega, thanking us all. And she says, I am particularly interested in how Karen is deploying the term remythologizing in Indigenous fantasy. And could you, Karen, say more about this? And could others speak about their approaches to remythologizing? And I might add into that another word that came to my mind as we were talking, which is resacralizing, or making sacred again the spaces, the natural spaces. So Karen, if you want to start, and then others.
Sure, thank you so much for that question. So it's actually, I've also read the Insipidity Scripts series, which I think is wonderful. And there are similar things in the sense that what Lindsay was just talking about, where it's taking the actual mythic figure and putting them into our contemporary space. So these characters, like you said, go to school and interact within our contemporary world with these mythic figures. And in the stories that I'm looking at, with these sort of shape-shifting human-eating sharks. And in one of the books, I see another question that says, is there a Yalo novel you would recommend? I would definitely recommend both stories that I talk about in my essay. The first one is called the Niuhi Shark Saga. It's a trilogy where the main character actually finds out that he is Niuhi Shark. And he's, you know, an orphan, he was adopted, and then finds out later that he is a Niuhi Shark and has to kind of deal with the legacy of that, because the story that this is based on, or the mo'olelo that this is based on, comes from his cousin, who actually ended up eating a lot of humans and ruining the relationship between humans and Niuhi hundreds of years ago, or kind of in mythic antiquity. And so he's charged with reestablishing that relationship, and in the process, helping to heal the ocean and heal the moana. So it's very much a literal taking of these mythic figures and dropping them into our actual world. And I think that that's what makes it really powerful, kind of what Lindsay was saying, right? That it helps the youth to really see how this applies right now in their actual lives, which is important, I think, for them. So, and then to Brian's kind of add on, the thing that I love about mo'olelo, and in Samoa, we have a similar form called whangongo, but these sort of traditional storytelling styles, is that they're almost always place-based. They're tied to a specific place, and they tell stories about how they explain how natural formations came to be, the weather, different plants and animals that are within that environment. And when they're retold and when they're given new life, it reinscribes these this ancestral knowledge onto that land, that in a lot of places throughout the Pacific has been sort of developed over through the process of colonization. So.
Yeah, and if I can jump in quickly, I absolutely, the Insipidity Script series is a total project of remythologizing West African mythology. You know, Insipidity Script is a real written script from West Africa that's been lost through colonization, that she draws on, and the books are full of Insipidity. You can see they're on the cover, they're at the start of every chapter, right? They appear everywhere. And the magic, you know, people in the story are called leopard people, and leopard societies are a real thing from the history of West Africa, and just the novels are full of spirits, masquerades, they're called ekwensu udide, who have been brought into the 21st century, who have brought into the problems of climate change. In one scene, ekwensu is responsible for an oil spill in the Delta river area, and it's full of that. But the trilogy also, if you want to use the word remythologize here, it certainly addresses any mythos that has developed around West African identity and African American or Black American identity. You know, my title refers to it as the Akata Witch series. That's the title of the first book, and then it's Akata Warrior, Akata Woman. And the word Akata is a derogatory term for African immigrants to North America, used by West Africans. Two of the children are Nigerian American, and two of them have just lived in Nigeria in the text. And the book spends the books, all three of them spend a lot of time reworking that word, Akata, and you know, transatlantic identity, you know, the history of the slave trade. All of these things have been brought forward, remythologized perhaps, you know, and just the agency of the child figures in the text in countering negative narratives around these, and just encountering it within themselves is just so fascinating and really powerful to read.
I think there is a strong link between the kinds of remythologizing projects that we're talking about and the emergence of some very powerful voices from among indigenous communities using these narratives in various ways. And that includes, we've mentioned African, Pacific Island, Native American, also Australian Aboriginal, where they have a history of 40,000 years of not destroying their environment while living in it. So, Alexander, anything more to add to that on the re-mythologizing?
Yeah, so I was thinking again of John Crowley's book, Ka, in the Ruin of Immer, which tells about, it tells about the history of humanity, basically, but it ends on the end of civilization. And the problem at the end of civilization is that human stories have lost their meaning. And if humans want to regain the world, they need to rethink their stories. And I think this is not directly connected to re-mythologizing, but I think allowing the kind of non-human mythology to creep in and to mesh with human mythology, and just figuring out how to do that is a tremendous task, which I think fantasy is very well equipped to do. But I think this kind of deprivileging the human hero, where the human hero is seen as like the figure to the ground of the environment, allowing environment and the hero to become enmeshed. I think that's a kind of something like re-mythologizing that deals away with the figure of the hero itself, and rather brings the environment to the fore. So I think that could be a powerful strategy. And I think lots of recent novels and stories are doing that. Yeah.
I was wondering, I'm so enjoying this panel. Thank you, everyone. I was wondering, as you spoke, that I realized that most of these chapters were written in 2019. This is like an old book. It takes, 2 years before it's published. And so much has happened in these 2 years, and the book has just come out. So I was wondering, as you think about your chapters, would there be anything you would like to add? Would there be anything that has not so much changed in your thinking, but that sort of an additional layer to your thinking about these issues, or maybe in terms of you already know more scholarship that talks about similar things, or you already know more works of fiction or film or games that deal with the issues that you discussed? I mean, anything that you've discovered since writing this chapter? And this is, I guess, a question to everyone, including Brian and Tereza.
I'll just begin by saying that I just recently did a paper for the Conference on the Fantastic in Florida on 4 recent fantasies by Native American writers. And I'm not going to think of all the names, but one of them was Darcy Little Badger. Was it Snake? What's the full title of that one? All of these were ways of bridging the gap, I guess, between a traditional way of living and seeing humans and the conditions that we're under today. And I think that these were very powerful, as I said, powerful voices from indigenous communities that challenge maybe some of those basic assumptions, as I think John and Alexander have both kind of reminded us of the power of the myth of capitalism, as if it's the only way to live in the world. And we are probably all aware of Ursula Le Guin's comment about how we live in capitalism. It's hard to imagine anything else, but the same was true of the divine right of kings, because anything that was composed by humans can be changed by humans. So, John, did you have something?
Yeah, well, I could say the final paragraph of my essay actually talks about the fact that I wrote that essay in March and April of 2020 during the initial lockdown of the pandemic. And I said at that time that nothing has disrupted the everyday workings of capitalism in my lifetime in a comparable way to what happened in those months under the pandemic, and that there obviously there was a lot of death and suffering, but there was an oddly utopian glimmer to seeing, the pollution disappear over Los Angeles and Delhi, and the kind of birds that I saw around my house that one had not seen before, just because there was so little traffic and things like that. Well, so 2 years on, what would one say? I know capitalism obviously came roaring back, and everyone knew that it would. And the point, I guess, is that the collective action that had to be taken at that moment, I thought at that point was kind of an optimistic harbinger of what could be done in a more sustained fashion to address climate change. I think what's probably become more prevalent over the last year and a half or two since then is the force of the counter forces, the forces of those who are trying to shut down any response to any collective response to those who call freedom, the freedom to do whatever I want to do right now, and the freedom not to have anyone else tell me that we have to act for the common good. So I think the thing that I would come to and emphasize more is that word, the common, the power of the common, the importance of the common, the importance of claiming the commons, of not having it defined into a kind of a straitjacket prescription for what kind of identity you can have, but rather an opening and sharing of what everybody, what and where everybody lives. Okay.
Lindsay?
Yeah, I think, speaking of common, you might have all had a common experience writing this right at the start of the pandemic. I know I did. This project gave a lot of structure to those very chaotic early months. On a very practical level, I'd changed the title of my chapter to reflect the actual title of the trilogy I'm writing about, which the book had already gone to print by the time that had been clarified. But more deeper thinking, the final book in this trilogy actually brings COVID into it right at the end. The heroes have returned from their latest major battle in sort of a fantasy otherworld, and they arrive and their parents are watching about the coronavirus lockdown on television. And it's I just stopped when I was reading it. I just took a moment, because what it does is it just brings, if we take COVID-19 pandemic, take the pandemic to be an anthropocenic event of sorts, in the way that it traveled around the world and its proliferation of plastic, just in it being a pandemic at all. it just brought the Anthropocene, the real, you know, challenges we face, right into lockstep with the, you know, fantastic challenges that the trilogy's protagonists had been facing all the way through. And in just the most interesting way, just put it right on the same playing field as fighting an evil spirit with your spirit out of your body. And it just reframed how we might think about these things, for me anyway.
Yes, and I'll just add on to that, that one of the challenges is to make the constructive stories more appealing and more compelling, so that it becomes impossible to ignore them, that they can compete with the older narratives that are trying to reemerge. Any last thoughts from anybody? We're almost out of time.
I might jump in very quickly. In my chapter, I'm basically writing about blurring the line between the organism and his or her environment. And since the 2020, I was also writing it at the beginning of the lockdown. I feel like my all other thinking and writing and personal experience is just adding another layers to this. Probably, if I was writing the chapter now, I might add more allusions to some really powerful creative pieces I have read since the time. I might want to add more of the works of material criticisms, because they talk with a really nice clever language about the very similar experience as Pratchett is writing in this very specific style. But for me, it seems to be like the continuous story, always evolving and somehow productive in other papers or experience.
If I may just, Alexander, go ahead.
No, you can say your...
So I just wanted to tie into this notion that Brian mentioned of resacralization. And I just finished reading Amitav Ghosh's The Nutmeg's Curse, where he makes this wonderful case for vitalism and for a return, that it is happening on so many levels, a return to perceptions of animism and vitalism of non-human agents, including rocks, trees, you know, so not only animals and plants. And I feel very encouraged because I see more and more of these stories, the stories that you wrote about, that change and push this perception toward not only blending the human and the non-human, but really creating a perception of extremely complicated but very exciting entanglements that all forms of life share on this planet, that we share far more than we have led ourselves to believe. And I find this trend, it's a very powerful trend, and I find it very encouraging.
Yeah, and a last word from Alexander.
Yeah, I'm going to say something along the same lines. I've been thinking in the last year or so about the virus and viruses and bacteria, etc. And it's a fascinating topic. I mean, it's the reality of COVID is horrible, but there is the utopian part to it, and also the story of life itself, how human cells and animal cells came to be by, you know, taking bacteria inside and turning them into organelles, and viruses probably played a big part in that. I think that's a fantasy story in itself. It's worthy of its own myths, and I think probably somebody has told them in some form, but maybe there should be more of that. I think Octavia Butler's fiction does a very good job, and I would be very excited to read more. I think there is indeed utopianism in this story as well.
Right. Tereza, do you want to sign us out? Give a thanks to everybody?
Yes, I would be happy to. Well, I wouldn't be so happy to sign us out because I would love to listen to this discussion for a much long time, but our time is up. So thank you, everyone. It has been wonderful. Thank you, first of all, for taking this amazing creativity to work on your pieces and your chapters. And thank you, everyone who is not among our panelists. It's a huge bunch of people. And huge thanks to Brian and Marek to being co-editors of this book. So it was a pleasure to see you at least remotely.